For this first lesson of Rhino, I will tell you about how to navigate it and how to familiarize yourself with the Rhino 3D environment and which windows to open from the get-go so that you can work in a very comfortable manner. The first thing I'm going to ask you, it's going to be to open this little window. It's called Edit Layers. So just bring the left cursor and activate this one, and it's called Layers. So this is where you're going to be able to separate your different drawing surfaces into different layers and have the work environment very organized. So I'm just going to ask you to bring the cursor, take this menu window and just drag it to the right like I'm doing, and you can resize it the way you want it. And have this open all the time. So whenever in the future you start Rhino, it's going to remember that the layer tab should be open in this way. I'm going to also left click right next to the layers tab. It's called the object properties. So I just left click and I'm going to take the tab from the properties, and I'm just going to drag it as such and bring it into the window like that. Okay, so now I've got the layers and properties tab open in a permanent way, and you won't have to deal with this in the future. Okay, so now the four viewports. You've got here the top viewport, the perspective viewport, the right viewport, and the front viewport. So basically the top, front, and right viewports are what we call orthographic viewports. So basically whatever you design in 2D, it's going to happen on these viewports. Whatever happens in 3D, obviously, as the name states, it's perspective. So everything works in a coordinate axis based on the X, Y, Z. So what you see here, this plane, for example, this surface is lying on the XY plane. If I refer back to the top viewport, I see the XY plane as well here. So that means whenever I start sketching in the top viewport, like this, if I zoom out here, everything that is happening, because I'm working on the XY grid in the top viewport, well, this grid is the same in perspective. And you can see that it's a fully flat 2D curve. So everything that is happening in the top viewport, it's reflected here on this grid on the XY plane. Okay. On the front viewport, it's a bit different. It's a different grid. This grid is different from what you see on the perspective grid. The perspective grid matches the one with the top viewport. So if I do a little demonstrations with the front viewport, and I just want to draw a set of 2D curves like this by clicking on this icon, and I start working like this. So if I look at the left-hand side corner here, you can see that I'm working on the ZX plane. So the ZX plane in perspective is here, and so if I rotate, I've sketched a 2D curve that is perfectly flat, okay, as you can see here. So that matches the front viewport, ZX. And if I go in the right viewport, it's the ZY plane that I'm going to be working on this time. So the ZY plane in perspective, you see, goes like this. So I use my curve tool, and I can start sketching on that plane. So these grids that you see in the right and front viewports are independent from that grid that you see in perspective. You just need to remember that. So whatever I sketch in the right viewport, you can see it here, and you've got a nice 2D curve. Okay, so just remember that. Okay, now to navigate, first, I'm going to recenter this object. So this geometries, I want to recenter on the viewport. There's a function called zoom extend. So I just bring my cursor on this icon here, and I just left click, and it recenters it. If I want to rotate, I just right click on in perspective viewport, and I'm doing a rotation as such. Okay. If I press shift and right click in perspective, I do what we call a pan. So it's a translation. And if I Control and right click, I zoom in and zoom out. Okay. If I go in the top viewport and I right click, I don't get a rotation, but I instead get the pan. Okay. If I just right click with my mouse button, so I get a pan, and if I press Control and right click, I zoom in and zoom out. Okay. You can also use your scroll wheel on your mouse, and you can zoom in, zoom out as well. So the same goes for the front viewport. So I just right click for pan, Control and right click for zoom in, zoom out. And the same obviously for the right viewports. So the right, front, and top viewports are what we call orthographic viewports. It's a projection and it allows you to do work in 2D. And the perspective viewport obviously works in the XYZ axis at the same time. Okay, so that's for the navigation. If you double click in the tab, you maximize. If you double click, you minimize. Okay, you double click here, maximize, double click, minimize. It works for all viewports. Okay. The other thing, if let's say that my geometries are completely way off the screen like this, and you're sort of lost, you know, you can always bring everything back together. You just right click on this icon, zoom extend all viewports at the same time. Okay, so I just need to rotate this one by just right clicking in the perspective viewport. All the viewports can be changed in terms of size. So for convenience, you know, some people prefer to work like that, which is fine. So you can play with those and rescale, resize your screens. So everything is movable. You can undock your toolbars, but I advise you to keep them as they are. Don't try to undock them. Keep the same setting as I have. So this is your main toolbar where you're going to start doing all the 2D sketches, creating your surfaces, your solids, and modifying those surfaces by using all these toolbars. You don't need to worry about these tabs. These tabs are just if you want to work on a specific function. For example, if I want to focus on just drafting and I want to dimension everything, I just select my drafting tab and that's all. But like I said, don't worry about all these little tabs. It's going to lead you to a bit of confusion when you're starting from the beginning. I know that Rhino can be sort of intimidating at the beginning, so just make sure that the standard toolbar is activated and you have all these menus available. Okay, all these tabs you find them inside the standard toolbar, so that's fine. And all the function also, all these tabs are also found inside these functions, so you don't need to worry about it. If you want to resize all the viewports back to its original state, you just bring your cursor on this icon here. It's called for viewports, and you just right click and it's going to resize everything and recenter your geometries as well. Okay, so that's for how to navigate with the environment. So I'm just going to maximize this. The one last thing I want to talk about is how to visualize your geometries. So what you're seeing here, it's just a bunch of 2D lines, okay? And if you want to see them in a different mode so that you can more easily read them, you just bring your cursor on the perspective tab, you right click, and you can switch to shaded mode. So here I'm in a shaded mode, and you can do your surfacing work, you know, while it's in shaded mode, and visualize better like that. Once you're going to start applying textures, image maps and all that, you right click on perspective, for example, and you have the rendered mode. So now you've got the different colors for your geometries. If I double click, I can do the same, and I'm going to double click on the top viewport. I can do the same thing here, so I just bring my cursor on the top tab and I just right click and I can go and switch to shaded viewport. I can switch to rendered viewport and so on. You've got the ghosted one, you've got the technical one, etc. So I invite you to play and explore this environment. I double click to minimize and that's it. Okay, so if you want to move your objects, start learning to move the objects, you've got this in this little icon here. It's called the transformation toolbar, and you've got a little black arrow. Whenever you see a little black arrow in the lower right hand side corner, that means you can expand the toolbar. So I'm going to bring my cursor above this little function called move, and I'm just going to press and maintain the pressure, and I'm just going to drag the toolbar into the viewport. So now I've expanded the transform toolbar. You can see its name here. So basically you've got the move tool, you've got the copy tool, you've got the rotate tool, etc., etc. So if you remember, in perspective, I'm working on the XY plane, so I can take that cube, for example. I just left click it, I press move, and I can see that my cursor converted into a crosshair, and immediately I have to look into the command line, which is very important, and it asks me for the origin point to move from. So for example, I can choose this point randomly, and I can start choosing where I want to put it in terms of destination point. So I just left click again, and I've just moved it as such. Okay, so if I double click and I maximize the top viewport, and I right click to go into a rendered mode, I can, for example, do again another move. So I just click left hand side click on move icon. Always pay attention to the command line. It's asked me which object I want to move, so I just select this cone, for example, and I right click for enter, and now it asks me point to move from, and I'm just going to choose any random point at this stage, and I'm just going to left click, and now I can move it wherever I want, and I left click again and I moved it. Okay, so if I want to do another type of transformation, I can do a rotation, for example. So I can left hand side click on this icon, rotate 2D. Again, it asks me to select the object to rotate, so I select this object and I press enter, and then it asks me for the center of rotation. So let's say, for example, I use that center of rotation, and now it asks me for the angle, so I'm just going to do it dynamically. I just left click on my mouse button, and I can rotate my object to the desired angle. Okay, I'll show you later on how to do it in a more precise manner, but for now it's just to familiarize how to move your objects and working with some basic functions on the toolbars. Another example that is very useful, how to do a mirror, for example. So I have the mirror function here, so I just left click on this icon, select object to mirror. So let's say I want to select this object, and then I press shift to select another object. So I select these two and I press enter. So you can either press enter on the keyboard, but I usually prefer to press right hand click on the mouse. It's the same, and I just now I'm asked now to put my beginning of the mirror plane. So left click and I define the axis of my mirror. Okay, so again I can choose them all at once like this. I choose mirror, my cursor converted into a crosshair, so I put the first point of my axis, and then I can put the second point of my axis wherever I want, for example here, and there you've got your copy and your mirror. Okay, so try and play with these little functions. There's another one here that could be interesting. It's also copy, so click here and I can take these two geometries like this and I press enter. So point to copy from, I click here and I can left click again a second time, a third time, fourth time, fifth time, and I make multiple copies until I right hand click and press enter, and you'll stop the function. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good way of introducing the basic tools, how to transform your objects. And I'll show you in the second lesson how to go into more details in familiarizing yourself with other tools that we're going to be exploring. Okay, so I hope you're going to be around for the next lesson. Thank you.